Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. It is 3 p.m. here in the UK and it's 10 a.m. Eastern time, and you're all most welcome to join us here at 0 Days Live. Hello there, everybody. Welcome to Wednesday of what is our penultimate week. We are 35 today, can you believe it? And today, of course, is our Security Begins Here edition, where in a few moments we'll be welcoming Davi Ottenheimer, VP of Trust and Digital Ethics from Inrupt. And he'll be talking to us about his perspectives on cyber. But also, don't forget, later this week, of course, we are celebrating National Solitaire Day on our Fun Friday edition, so don't miss that. Hello, everybody. I hope you are well. My name's Stuart Reed, and I'm with Nominet, focused on cyber solutions. And as usual, I'm in the chair today and every other day to welcome our special guests onto our live shows. Just a quick reminder, of course, Nominet's primarily known for managing the .uk domain space, and we've been doing so for the last 23 years or so now, which is allowed us to have something in the region of 15 million domains currently under our management. And of course, building on this strong heritage of understanding the importance of domain names for network connectivity, we also provide cybersecurity solutions to both enterprise and governments worldwide to protect them from cyber attacks. And that includes providing service to the UK government's National Cybersecurity Centre. Now, ensuring people are able to be connected, included and secure, is at the heart of what we do here at Nominet, and it's perhaps more important now than ever before. And with that in mind, we wanted to bring you an interactive show in 0 Days Live, which perhaps bridges that gap left behind by the lack of physical meetings taking place right now. So we've created our accessible community for everyone with an interest in or from within the cybersecurity community. Now, as always, I am joined both front of house and behind the scenes with a highly capable team, making sure everything runs just the way it should, albeit remotely right now. You'll recognize our regular viewers that everyone behind the scenes as well as in front has been doing an excellent job for us here at 0 Days Live. So big thanks to everybody that has been assisting us with that. Now, you'll also know that each and every week we ask a different burning question. Now, this week's burning question is, what lessons have you learned in lockdown? So please do let us know by simply typing into your console on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, for me, today, it's been able to perhaps get an adjustment to my work-life balance and separate one from the other. It's all too easy to be always on, especially as we are now far more connected than perhaps we ever were before. But as a result, it's really made me think about taking a conscious decision to set aside some quality family time too. So that's one thing, for me at least, that I've learnt in lockdown, is to kind of create the difference between a work and a life balance. So Steve, good afternoon to you. What lessons have you learnt in lockdown?
Good afternoon, Stuart. I think one of the lessons I've learned is how much I take for granted the ability to get things like shopping very quickly. You know, things like next day delivery, perhaps click and collect or delivering your supermarket shopping. You know, I kind of took that for granted, that would always be available and was the norm. And then all of a sudden that gets taken away from you and you think, oh, you know, I've got to wait for things now, or certain things aren't in stock, or I've got to actually go to a supermarket. So I think, you know, that's something I've learned, is not to take these things for granted and to appreciate them when they are available. Yeah,
I actually think it's a really good point, because there is we were kind of in a bit of a cycle of a whole concept of immediacy, and I think what this situation has done is kind of showed, as you say, that actually sometimes those cycles can be broken, sometimes for good reason, and perhaps make us slightly more appreciative of some of the things that we've got when we get them. So thank you very much for that, Steve. Now, everybody at home, this show really isn't the same without you tuning in. So we are delighted to be welcoming both our regulars and new audience members each and every day as we build out our accessible community to bring people together, hear from others in the industry, get a roundup of what's going on in the news, share some thoughts on best practice, and of course, as you would have known from the previous 34 live shows that we've done as part of our series at 0 Days Live, interject a bit of good humour along the way too. So with that in mind, we do cover a lot of important subjects, but we don't take ourselves too seriously. And as a quick reminder, each of our 30-minute or so shows is absolutely and completely live every single day. So as such, there has been, as you all know, and the bound to be for the remaining run of our shows, a few mild blips probably along the way, but if and when they do happen, we hope you reflect on them with a wry smile, as it was just part of the reason that you tuned in to see us every single day. And I also remember that whilst we do appreciate you tuning in and giving up some of your day to join us live, we know that's not always possible. So we are here on your on demand for your convenience too. So do check us out at nominetcyber.com/0dayslive. And please do get involved. This is your show as well. So if during today's show or any other live shows that you join, you want to ask a question or give comment, please do so by using the console on your screen. And Kerry will read those out during the webcast. And speaking of Kerry, good afternoon. How are you today?
Hi, I'm great, thank you, Stuart. How are you? You look quite warm.
Do you know what? Today is probably one of the warmest days that we've had this year. It's absolutely glorious where I am today. How is it with you?
Yes, it's lovely. I've got my door open, so if any cats walk onto the show, part of the charm, remember.
Well, you said you wanted a cat, so you could start collecting them. So, Kerry, on a serious note, which of course isn't that serious, but what lessons have you learned in lockdown?
So don't make it a serious lesson. So I have actually, slightly linked to Steve's point, learned how to enjoy my own company. So I'm spending a lot of time by myself at the moment, and there's so many creative things that you can do with your time that I just didn't need to do before. So I have been waiting for 3 weeks for this to come through, which is, oh, wrong way, an adult painting by numbers. I'm absolutely very excited. It arrived this morning, so that's me and my bank holiday weekend sorted.
So I thought that was a massive box of chocolates when you first got that out. Steve, looking agog there, you obviously thought something else. No,
yeah, I thought it was some kind of food, but yeah, it's painted by numbers. I mean, that is, yeah. I'm going to really enjoy seeing the output of that, Kerry.
Yeah, actually, that should, yes, indeed. Next week, Kerry, I want to be seeing the progress of that paint by numbers. I have to admit, I hadn't heard of an adult paint by numbers until maybe a couple of weeks ago when somebody else that I know started to embark on that challenge. It's actually a bit more difficult than it first appears. So I am looking forward to seeing how you got that.
Okay, I'll keep you posted.
Please do and enjoy it over the weekend in the garden, hopefully, if it's nice weather. Now, before we meet today's special guest, what we would like to do right now is take a quick look at the recent interview that we did when we caught up with him a few weeks ago. So before we introduce today's special guest, take a look at this first.
You really need to know when you get into a relationship with a provider if they have a bill of health. So we need strong identity systems in order to help us present the identity that we'd use to access the data. I think underestimated right now, although always in the back of people's minds, is when they trust a cloud provider, they need to know that somebody inside isn't violating that trust.
Excellent. So there were some interesting points being made on that. So I would like to welcome to our virtual studios Davi Ottenheimer from Inrupt. Welcome, Davi. And also, it must be said for the purposes of our audience, you're actually going to be the first guest that's joining us by audio only. Now, this week, we've simply been plagued by the ghost of technology past, which has given us a few challenges, but we are 50% there at least, so we are able to welcome you at least from on an audio perspective. So how are you today, Davi?
I'm fine, thank you, and sorry for the difficulties. Hopefully my voice will compensate.
Absolutely, I can hear you crystal clear, which is excellent. So thank you very much for joining our virtual studios here today. Some interesting points you raised in that video that we just saw then. So at least the viewers did actually get to see what you look like, even if we can't bring you live on screen today. But before we get into some of the questions that I'd like to pick up on, you heard that we do ask a burning question each and every week. So we'd like to ask you, what lessons have you learned in lockdown?
I think the most fundamental one for me is the power of the individual action on society as a whole. The latest data shows that just by staying home, 250,000 lives were saved, some 2 million hospitalizations were avoided. There's very few examples in life where you can say, if I just make this simple change in my behavior, I can save 250,000 people's lives. And I don't want to put a value on different lives, but often people talk about doctors and first responders and police and how important they are to critical functioning of society. You can save a lot of police lives, a lot of doctors and nurses' lives. That's a phenomenal change in the perception, I think, of where we started to where we are, to have real data showing there's a real lesson here that by small individual action, you can have a huge benefit to society.
And you're right. I think there has been a real spotlight on data points, and there's some phenomenal numbers that are being banded around. As you touched on there, we're living through pretty extraordinary times right now, and continue to do so. So thank you very much for that. Now, by way of an introduction, can you give us just a bit of a brief overview of how you end up looking at cybersecurity?
That's a long story. I've been doing this for over 2 decades now. I started in the mid 90s. I was actually in London at the London School of Economics studying history, and then switched directly into technology. People think that's an odd or a hard switch, but back then it made a lot of sense to me because I was basically going into libraries, reading all the books I could, and writing up a report of who did what, where, when. Why did something happen? I switched into technology in the sense that I just looked at the computers and did the exact same thing. I was able to tell people what happened, and I was investigating criminal activity straight out of the gate. On the early Windows NT 3.5, 3.5.1 servers, we saw break-ins constantly. So from the 80s when I was a kid and playing with computers to becoming a professional in the beginning of the 90s to today, it's always really been about cybersecurity. I think the first exposure I had to real cybersecurity, as it's called today, must have been the early 1980s with the 414s being on the cover of Newsweek, and I thought, wow, they're just like me. These people, they're everywhere. So it's been a long journey, and I'm not sure I could give an exact date that I entered, but it feels like forever ago. But I know it's been my entire life now.
And it's been pretty fascinating. Like you, I've been in cybersecurity or focused on cybersecurity for many years now, right back when it was known as IT security, not quite as perhaps glamorous as with the cybersecurity tag that it now has. But certainly there's been a huge amount of change over that time from really being focused on the IT profession to something that's far more widely understood now, I guess, in terms of the mainstream, and people are able to relate to it as you'd expect, particularly now, given that we're so digitally reliant. So yeah, fascinating times. I totally agree with you. Now, Inrupt is quite a different company. Are you able to give us a bit of an overview of what it sets out to do?
Sure. I think most people have heard of Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and he's spoken for a while about his mission. The solid W3C concept. The project is to present a very powerful yet very simple concept. It's going to remake the web. A lot of people joke about that because it's such a huge, shoot for the moon type project, but it's very serious in the sense that he built the web in the beginning, or at least, generated a decentralized way of information sharing, and that turned into the web in such a way that it was very successful for a while, but in the decentralized concept, it became overly centralized. So the idea of Inrupt is to sort of help lead the way in bringing solid to life, where your data lives in a pod, is what we call it, controlled by you, and any data that's generated by you or the things that you own goes to your pod. So you control access now in a very meaningful way, where you really have consent over and power over your data. Inrupt is thus bringing to life the solid project. It's one of the first movers. I mean, our goal is to really bring a global enterprise grade version of Solid that people can build applications on, so that we can really reinvigorate and reinvent the web to be decentralized and also a much wider market.
And it's interesting you touch on that, because one of the areas I'd like us to explore as part of today's conversation is something that's quite relevant to everybody, which is around third-party risk. So the kind of the notion of being able to control what data goes in there and how they interface with that's actually quite interesting. Are you able to give us a bit of an overview of what this kind of third-party risk might be?
Yeah, there are many manifestations of it. Evil Maid might be one of the most famous, where you stay in a hotel, you have a service provider, and you sort of grant them the ability to go into your room and clean your things. When I was working in China, for example, I found that when I'd come back to my room, my USB cables had been wrapped up neatly with a bow on them. my dirty laundry was washed and folded. Things like that were not expected. I didn't ask for them. And so what kind of risk you expose yourself to when you have a third party working for you is kind of a question of trust around services, any kind of community you belong to, whether it be from your parents, your children, your maid, your nanny, your boss, right? Those are the third party risk and relationships you build, and why trust is so important when you do have third parties.
And I think building on that then, so why might organizations not have fully appreciated the kind of risk associated with these third parties?
There's a lot of problems with trust models in that people make assumptions and they believe that there are reasons people wouldn't do the wrong thing. Whether these are social norms, concepts like too big to fail, economic reasons, laws, penalties, enforcement. Some people think bad things won't happen because they can penalize people after they happen. Some people think they won't happen because they put preventative measures and walls up or things like that. And they're all subject to test, hacking, and ridicule. There's constant pressure for people to do things other than what expectations are. That's the nature of hacking. So
Great.
People didn't fully appreciate ultimately how clever adversaries will be or how weak their controls are.
Thank you for that. And I've just noticed, I don't know if you can see us actually, Davi, but for regulars of the show, that they'll know and also anticipate that at any moment when I'm talking to a guest, that Steve will pop up on screen and raise his virtual hand, which means he's either got something insightful to say or more likely a question to ask. So what have you got for us, Steve?
I've got a question, please.
Great.
So, Davi, I was interested to hear how organisations are currently viewing the risk of third parties. What do you think the current viewpoint is?
Well, it depends by industry and sector. Healthcare might be one of the best examples, where we saw a major shift, especially in the United States, from business associates, which are literally a third party handling data, to being sort of assumed to be doing the right thing, to highly accountable. You can't just say the business associates should be doing the right thing. You have to go and actually test them and audit them. You see similar things with PCI. There's increasing focus on ISO, these standards, these third-party assessments. All of that is around organizations realizing that assuming people would do the right thing, or assuming controls are in place, or assuming someone even exists inside those third parties to be thinking in your best interests, all of those may be dangerous assumptions. So I've definitely seen a move towards third-party assessments of third parties, and self-assessments are fairly broken. One of the most egregious examples is Facebook, of course, which has failed at self-regulation consistently and has just announced that they're going to do more self-regulation. And there's a lot of skepticism around, why would you even bother announcing more of the same? It's different, I guess you could say, in how they're approaching it, but it's still self-regulation, not enough.
Absolutely, thank you. And do you think there is an appetite in some of those other industries to shift the responsibility for third-party risk? Would Inrupt advocate a way that can actually be done, or is it impossible to do?
I'm not sure Inrupt would be an advocate in the sense of regulation, but I know that from a decentralization model, right, what we're doing is taking control back of data, because you aren't well served by assuming that Facebook will handle your data well. In fact, the opposite. Once your data goes into these hands of who knows who, Cambridge Analytica and so forth are just screaming examples of the type of misuse, the sort of friends of friends phenomenon, where you give your data to someone and they give it to someone else without notifying you. To me, that's the equivalent of a public relationship. This is discussed in terms of an invitation. If I have a +1, is that a public invitation. In hardcore security technical verbiage, it is, because I didn't say +1 based on a list or requirements, a filter. I said +1, meaning anyone in the world now can be your +1. So the idea that any industry would be subject to this is, the human condition. So Interupt's development around control and consent of your own data means not that you would be able to anticipate all conditions, but that you'd be able to react to all conditions. So at the point you thought someone was abusing your data, you could turn off their access. It's like a power button. This is one of the most fundamental concepts moving into AI, for example. Machines need a power off button. They absolutely have to have some way of stopping them. They also need a reset button. So the idea that someone is using your data and you don't like it the way they're representing you, having provenance and the ability to say, I am the official voice of my own data, is super powerful. So now you can reset and power off. So that's more of what Interupt's vision is in bringing Solid to life, is giving that kind of control over your data. It really flips the trust model around. Rather than going to the Facebook organization and opening the door and going in where you can be in your own digital body that they allow you to inhabit, which is such a weird way of looking at the world. The future could be that Facebook comes and knocks on your door where you live and you keep all of your things, and they say, would you like a service? And you say, sure, I will allow you in to do that specific thing, but as soon as I feel like you've done something wrong, untoward, violated my rights, I can push you out and close the door and use a different service provider.
Thanks. I think if Facebook came knocking on my door, I'd keep it closed, but I understand the concept that you're talking about. And I think there's some really good examples there of how third-party risk can be tackled, and it sounds great, some of the innovative ways that you're looking at it from an Interrupt perspective in terms of how they could potentially be tackled. Can you think of any other examples of how that third-party risk might be tackled from your perspective?
Well, transparency classically, or auditing classically, which I've touched on a little bit, is how people approach it. So if you wanted to trust somebody, you would ask them, could you audit them yourself if you were so qualified or desired, or would they have someone do it for you that you could look at? Some, bearing of a certificate. You trust a doctor because they go through a process that ultimately supposedly makes them qualified because they have an MD. Lawyers have to go through a bar process. There are a lot of reasons that people be removed from certifications. So a lot of that centers around models of authorization based on some community that has a process for pushing success forward and pushing failures out. Yeah.
Great. It's fascinating stuff you're sharing with us there, Davi, and it's an interesting concept. So it'd be interesting to see, how things move in terms of the way that we treat and the way that we respect the data and the thresholds there as well. Kerry, I would imagine that we've got some questions in from the audience around this as well, because I know that it's quite a popular subject.
Yes, we do, absolutely. Yes, we have a question from Julie. She's asking, will we ever be able to control the flow of data within the internet enough to truly gain control of our own data?
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that we would truly gain control of our own data, setting aside truly is a very dangerous word. Truly, absolutism can be very dangerous. So can we get control of our own data? Absolutely. In the truest sense of absolutism, we can control data because already there's many levels of which our data can flow. But we have a sense of secrecy that we can preserve. The question becomes if we can expand our sense of secrecy to levels of confidentiality in terms of classification levels or public data, and whether that is a violation in terms of control. So for example, we've spent so much time working on availability and confidentiality as control of our own data. Can I prevent my data from being lost? Right now, you can get to about 100% availability. You can spread your data around the world in such a way that it is almost impossible to get rid of that data. In terms of confidentiality, we've gotten to the point where the key exchange protocols are fairly solved. The levels of privacy that you can get through proper key management are really impressive now. If you put enough skin in the game, you can really keep things private forever. It's very difficult to break some of the more advanced encryption solutions, and they're very granular too. I've worked on that for a long time. In fact, I released some end-to-end field level encryption for a major database. So I feel like we can be very comfortable about that kind of control. of our data. The problem becomes the integrity of the data, where we push it out and it gets corrupted or misused, or we get misrepresented. I think that's where we really have the most trouble right now. There are a lot of attempts, but there aren't any excellent answers or solutions. And so I think that's where we're going to have to push hardest right now. So yes, we're absolutely able to control flow of data with availability and confidentiality controls, but it begs the question of whether we can also balance those with integrity. And I say balance because when you think about it, spreading your data everywhere is a violation of privacy. So it ruins confidentiality, but availability might be the only thing you care about. Whereas if you go really confidential, it really messes with your availability. Because if you have one copy and you only have the one key and you lose it, it's gone forever. But that's what you wanted. So these are inherently contradictory, things, the control areas that we're trying to build, which makes it very challenging and interesting every day.
Great, thank you. And then Harrison's just asking, what's the role of blockchain in understanding your footprint of your data?
I always say blockchain is like a ledger. To me, it's like Microsoft Excel or Lotus 123. These are very useful tools, but you don't live in a spreadsheet. Well, some people do, but you really shouldn't live in a spreadsheet. Life is much broader and bigger than that. So blockchain represents an advance in how we build ledger systems. It has a lot of downsides. There's a brittle aspect to it. There's a natural tendency towards centralization to avoid the brittleness. It brings forward a lot of risk as well as solutions. So I think it needs to be balanced out. But for example, a very practical use case is if you were issued a credential and you wanted to put it in something which was an official ledger that was tamper-proof, you would use something like a blockchain. So you get an identity created, it has a timestamp and some metadata around it, and you can then query the ledger to see when was it created and who was it created for. That's a very useful system. But what you do with that, how you take that identity and where you store it and what you do with it over your life may not go into the blockchain. There may be other systems that you're using, wallets, purses, and systems that are doing far more than the blockchain can do.
Great, thank you. And then just quickly, finally, from Matt, he's asking, which industries do you think will benefit the most from INRUPT's approach?
I would like to say everybody will benefit that benefited from the web. And I think there's no limit to the industries when you think about who the web has touched. So it's kind of the opposite. Is there an industry that won't benefit from rethinking or transforming how they do business? With this pandemic, we've seen a huge shift, transformation, massive shift into digital world where more and more people are using the web for everything. Even this video conference, although we don't have video working, is web-based. And so the idea behind INRUPT is to make that go even further, an even bigger, broader market, because we would allow people to decouple the app development from these massively centralized web platforms. Right now, if you want to build an app, you're probably going to build an app on Google or for Google or Chrome, or you're going to build the app to use data that's already in Google, and you're going to store the data in Google now, or Apple for that matter. They're very centrist. Whereas if you move to the solid model, then you're moving away from that and saying, I can write an app and all I have to do is know the protocol, the standard by which to store data. It takes a huge burden off your shoulders. And I only have to know the protocol standard by which to grab an identity from any identity source. So I'm focused entirely now on writing apps, which opens up massive new markets. It really levels the playing field and opens up all kinds of innovations, gets us out of the sort of lock-in that's holding us back right now.
Great, thank you very much.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate your the questions, of course, from the audience as always, but also your insights into this, Davi, as well. It's quite clear that the work that you guys are doing at INRUPT is pretty innovative, and there's some fairly disruptive techniques that you're looking at bringing into place, and certainly calls into question some of the ways that maybe we could manage third-party risk in the future as well. Are there any final takeaways you'd like to leave our audience today?
Well, I'd like to invite everyone on board. The more people we get interested in working on this, the more views and diverse views we get, the better. So please feel free to reach out, check out our website and the solid specification protocol. Please join the community and send your comments. It's an opportunity to really make a significant change and to improve the world for the better. I think there's an opportunity here that doesn't come along. I was there for the first web when it was built, and it was an exciting time. And looking back, there are a lot of things we could have done differently. I think that's the nature of Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his motivation. When you talk to Vint Cerf or Tim, you really see in their eyes this aspiration, this optimism, this hope, and it's great to be on board with that. So I invite everyone else to join as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Davi. Apologies to both you and also the audience that the technology defeated us once again this week, but I think everyone will agree that it was a fascinating insight to some of the work that you and Inrupt are doing. So I do appreciate you joining us on the show today. That's Davi Ottenheimer from Inrupt. So thank you very much for that, Davi. Before we close today's show, just want to hand back to Kerry for a quick wash up of today's news. What have you got for us, Kerry?
Thank you. Info Security magazine reports that NPower and AT&T have launched a new program in Dallas to train veterans and their families for careers in cybersecurity. NPower states that many veterans already possess the necessary skills for a career in security, and the market is set to grow by 32% in the US over the next decade, so the skills will be in high demand. Another story in Info Security magazine claims that a hack of a potential entertainment law firm may result in sensitive information about Madonna being put up for auction. The group initially targeted law firm with a ransomware attack, but the firm did not pay, and this has resorted to the information being held online. And then finally, so DNet have an article from Ozpost that reportedly suffered 300 cyber incidents this year, although nothing to cause major disruption. The CISO stated that the majority of the incidents were attempted phishing campaigns.
Great. Well, thank you very much again. A lot of different varied news on there, Kerry, but also some common themes there. So actually, it's pretty. We talked about innovation on this show today. It's perhaps pretty innovative, the initiative that Empower and AT&T have got. I mean, we've talked on this show, and it's a well-covered subject beyond as well around the skills gap. So what better way to start building on the valuable security skills that have been learned in the army? So interesting perspective on that. Also, ransomware yet again rears its very ugly head on here as well. And again, it does go to show that this is not a victimless crime, and this is a criminal activity, and it can be pretty unpleasant as well. Steve, what were your thoughts on today's news?
Yeah, I mean, I think that article on the law firm and ransomware is interesting. I believe it's not just Madonna, but the law firm have many other famous clients, potentially including some data around Mr. Trump himself. So it could be interesting to see if that ever does get leaked in terms of the impact on those individuals. But again, we've talked about ransomware, many times across the show. But we're also starting to see this kind of advancement of ransomware, where it includes some kind of data extraction as well. And it's now kind of highly believed that data extraction is always going to be part of ransomware now. And if you don't pay the ransom, then they're going to publish that information on the web for others to see. And you can only think of the reputational damage of something like a law firm if their client's information is leaked into the public. I mean, it's
I guess the other thing there, Steve,
could be
of course, is if they're going to be taking the actual data or seeing that data rather than just encrypting it and charging a ransom, then what's to stop them after they've given you the data back to still use that data for their own purposes anyway? So I think it's an interesting extension of why somebody should never pay a ransom attack.
Yeah, and there's also increasing evidence to show that even once they've deleted that element of the data or decrypted your data, they've still maintained some kind of they've installed some malware to come back time and time again. And we've seen in the past couple of months some big companies that have been hit more than once with this type of attack. So there's increasing evidence that is the case.
And I get, it's evidence again that ransomware is not going away, and it's kind of morphing is what it looks like. And I'm sure that we'll be hearing more about that kind of attack in due course. So thanks for your thoughts on that, Steve. That really is it for today, everybody. So thank you to today's special guest, Davi Ottenheimer from Inrupt, and of course to everyone here, 0 Days Live. So Steve and Kerry joining myself front of house, to everyone that was making sure that we were running smoothly behind the scenes as well. Thank you to all of you, and of course to all of you for tuning in as you do every single day. It's much appreciated, and we look forward to having you join us again soon. So until then, do have an excellent rest of the day, regardless of what you're doing, and be sure to tune in again. Until then, goodbye.